Story number 6. Somewhere between the beginning and the beyond. By the time I reached Rome, I wasn't counting cities anymore. Not really. The map in my notebook had long since become a constellation of names more than places. Each dot a voice, a silence, a person who handed me something invisible and asked nothing in return. Marcus with his broken foundation turned empire. Camilla and her cake made from memory and ash. Matteo dancing barefoot on the salt. Tomas threading spines. Clocka moving like the wind was something she could talk to. They didn't fix me, but they made it possible to keep going. And now Rome. Elizabeth used to describe it like a fever dream. A place where everything is still standing and still falling apart at the same time. She said, "It's like walking through a love letter written in crumbling marble." I didn't understand what she meant until I got there. There's something about this city that insists you look at it with both reverence and irreverence. A broken arch next to a convenience store. A Michelangelo in a church no one queues for. Laundry lines flapping above centuries of blood and beauty. I wandered with no destination. That had become a kind of ritual. Just me, the compass around my neck, and Elizabeth's voice tucked somewhere between my ribs. It was in the shadow of the Forum, where old gods still murmur beneath the ground and tourists throw questions at statues, that I met Volus. He was standing near a handmade sign that read, "Walk with Time, Rome Tours Free-ish." The W had been scratched out and redrawn 3 times. It leaned sideways like it had lived a life. Volus looked like he hadn't slept properly in a week, which is to say he looked like someone who lived in what he loved. Loose blazer, museum pins on his satchel, dark curls that caught the wind like ivy on old stone. He had a guide's voice, not the kind that lectures, but the kind that wants to make you feel like you've been invited into a story already in progress. "You thinking about Julius Caesar?" he called out. "Or just admiring the scaffolding?" I smiled, caught. "A bit of both." "Then you're in the right place," he said. "I'm Volus. Historian by training, tour guide by necessity, an incurable romantic by genetic design. The next tour starts whenever someone asks a sincere question." I didn't hesitate. Did anyone ever grieve in public in ancient Rome? That stopped him for a moment, pleasantly surprised. Then he launched into a tale about professional mourners and public lamentation, arms flailing in excitement, voice dipping and soaring like he was conducting ghosts. What started as a joke became an hour. Then 2. I followed him through crumbling temples and sunlit piazzas, across bridges that had survived emperors and floods and even modern bureaucracy. Volus didn't just know the stories, he felt them. He told them like they were veins in his own body. Eventually, we paused at the base of the Palatine Hill, our shadows stretched long on the dusty stones. "You know," he said, "I used to think I wanted to be an archaeologist. Write papers. Lecture halls. Latin quotations and footnotes." He kicked at a pebble. "But after my dad died, everything shifted. He wasn't a historian, but he loved the idea that the past could hold us. Like scaffolding. After the funeral, I came here. To this exact spot, actually. I stood right there," he pointed to a patch of shade, "and realized I didn't want to study ruins. I wanted to speak through them." Volus told me how he started giving tours, poorly at first. How he mixed up emperors, confused aqueducts with amphitheaters, once told a group of Germans that Augustus was allergic to olives. But somehow, people kept listening, kept coming back. Because he wasn't performing. He was reaching. "I think stories," he said, "are the only way we survive. Not because they fix things, but because they let us carry the weight out loud." When I told him about Elizabeth, about the compass, about the places I'd carried her to, he didn't look away. Didn't offer platitudes. He just nodded. "I think Rome was made for that kind of grief," he said. "The kind that wants to be seen. The kind that doesn't pretend." Before we parted, he pressed a replica coin into my hand. A worn sestertius. Probably from a souvenir shop. But the gesture landed. "It's not real," he said. "But it has weight. And sometimes that's enough. I slipped the coin into my pocket, next to the compass. He walked off toward another group gathering near the Arch of Constantine, already gesturing, already grinning, already halfway through his next sentence. And I stood there for a while, alone among the ruins. Not broken. Just still speaking. The city that never stops moving, Chiara, the tram conductor. It was just past 7 in the evening when I stepped onto Tram 3, one of those long, groaning streetcars that snakes through the belly of Rome like a rusted thread. The kind that locals complain about, but still trust more than the weather. The doors hissed closed behind me. The tram jolted forward. I wasn't going anywhere specific. I just wanted to see the city move. Inside, the car was half full. Students with headphones. An elderly couple holding plastic grocery bags like relics. A boy with a bouquet of sunflowers resting in his lap, eyes closed. Everyone was traveling and no one was talking. That's when I saw her. She moved through the aisle like she'd been born in that space. Lean, steady, alert. Her uniform was simple, navy vest, ID badge, a satchel slung across one shoulder like it carried more than just tickets. She wore her dark hair pinned in a practical twist, and her eyes were quick, sharp, alive. She noticed me watching. "You're not from here," she said. Not accusing, just accurate. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who ride every day," she replied. "You're holding on like the floor might disappear." I smiled. "It might. I've had stranger things happen." She laughed, not loud, but real. "Then you've taken the right tram." Her name was Chiara. She didn't sit. She rarely did. Instead, she stood by the door between stops, arms crossed like a bridge holding two sides of the car together. She checked a few tickets, nodded at familiar faces, helped a young woman with a stroller navigate the narrow aisle. She moved with ease. With rhythm. I asked her how long she'd worked the line. She glanced at the ceiling, as if the answer might be written there. 14 years. 3 lines. 5 uniforms. 2 strikes. 1 divorce. She smiled. About 2 million kilometers of movement, and maybe half that in conversations. "Do you like it?" That made her pause. "I don't know if like is the word. But I'm still here." She motioned for me to follow her to the back of the tram. We stood by the window as Rome rolled past, kids kicking soccer balls in alleyways, Vespas weaving like ribbon, laundromats glowing in twilight. The air smelled like car exhaust and bread. Chiara tapped the glass gently with her finger. "You see all of this? Every day. Same route. Same tracks. And yet, never the same ride. Not once." I looked at her. "You remember everyone?" "No," she said. "But I remember moments." She began to list them like beads on a rosary. A man who cried quietly into a brown paper bag after the hospital. A girl who boarded barefoot, holding only a violin. A bride who changed her mind mid-ride, threw her bouquet out the window near San Giovanni. A boy who whispered poetry to the window. A nun who kissed a woman's forehead and said, "Don't be afraid." A man who died in his seat and wasn't noticed until Termini. She looked out the window again. "You sit still long enough, and the world climbs aboard." There was no sorrow in her voice. Just wait. And wonder. "I used to think it was just a job," she said. "Punching tickets. Moving people. But now I think I'm part of something bigger. A thread. Holding the city together in small, quiet ways." She looked at me then, her eyes softer. "I've seen grief, too. So much of it. People carrying it in their hands, on their backs, in their silences. You learn to recognize it. Not by how someone looks, but by how they hold the space around them." I swallowed, the compass around my neck suddenly heavy. "You saw it in me." She nodded. "It walks ahead of you." We rode in silence for a while. At Porta Maggiore, she turned to me. "You know what this job really teaches you?" "What?" "That everyone is between something. Between jobs. Between mistakes. Between lovers. Between beginnings and ends. The tram is just the space where they get to rest a little, when no one expects anything of them except to move. The doors hissed open. A few passengers got off. A few more got on. The cycle resumed. And still, she stood. I asked her if she ever wanted to leave. To stop moving. Of course, she said. But then I'd miss the stories. And what would I do with all of them? I didn't have an answer. When my stop came, I hesitated. She noticed. It's okay, she said. You can stay on. I do. But I got off. Because that's the thing about people like Chiara. They remind you that forward doesn't always mean far. That sometimes, movement itself is enough. The tram pulled away, its red lights trailing into the Roman dusk. And I stood there, watching the city keep going. The dream in the dough, William's moment at the pizzeria. When the tram disappeared around the curve near Trastevere, I stood on the curb longer than I meant to, watching the rails shimmer under the streetlight like they were still vibrating from all the lives they'd just carried. I felt full and hungry. Not just from the stories Chiara had poured into me like tea on a rainy day, but from the ache that still lingered, a hunger for something that didn't feel like grief. Something simpler. Something mine. My stomach growled loud enough to make a passing cyclist glance back. So I followed the smell of garlic and scorched basil until I found myself outside a tiny pizzeria with no name, just a faded awning, 2 plastic tables, and a man behind the counter with hands dusted in flour and a towel slung over his shoulder like a flag of surrender. It didn't look like a place that wanted attention. Which meant, of course, that it was exactly where I needed to be. I sat. I didn't ask for a menu. I just said, whatever's best. The man gave a single nod, disappeared into the kitchen, and re-emerged 20 minutes later with a pizza that looked like something conjured, not cooked. The crust was blistered and soft in all the right places. The tomato sauce smelled like it had been whispered to by someone's grandmother. The mozzarella sighed when I cut into it. I took a bite. And the world slowed. No music. No conversation. Just the crunch, the melt, the warmth of a food so alive it reminded me I still had taste buds. And a body. And a heartbeat. And something dangerously close to hope. I took another bite, and another. The sky above was turning cobalt, the kind of Roman blue that felt too rich to be accidental. I leaned back in the chair, letting the pizza cool and the moment settle. And then it happened. A thought. No, not a thought. A dream. Tiny. Barely formed. But there. What if I stayed? Just for a little while. A few months. A season. I could find a room above a bakery. I could teach English at the language school I passed earlier. I could learn to make coffee the right way. I could write, not just about loss, but about presence. About the taste of fire-roasted tomatoes. About trams and ghosts and widows and dancers and bees. I could live. The idea startled me so much, I laughed. Out loud. Alone. Because I hadn't had a dream since Elizabeth died. Not really. I'd had motion. Vows. Pilgrimage. But not dreams. Dreams meant future. And until now, I hadn't believed I had one. I sat there a long time, chewing slowly, not because I wanted to savor the flavor, but because I was savoring the moment. I could still want things. Still imagine. Still feel hunger for something besides memory. When I finished the last bite, I wiped my mouth with a paper napkin that disintegrated in my hands. The man behind the counter gave me a thumbs up like he knew. Maybe he did. As I stood to leave, he called out in Italian, something quick and warm. I turned. Scusa? He gestured to the empty plate and said, Quando mangi così, significa che hai trovato casa. I blinked. I'm still learning. What did you say? He smiled. It means, when you eat like that, it means you've found home. I nodded. And I walked into the Roman night, not searching this time, not aching. Just walking. With something soft and dangerous and alive tucked just beneath my ribs. A dream. A room with a view of tomorrow. Rome at night feels like it knows something. It glows, not loudly, but in a way that suggests it's been glowing this long for a reason. Lanterns hung from curved alleyways. Scooter lights bouncing off puddles. Laughter slipping out of half-shuttered windows like secrets that don't mind being overheard. After the pizza, I wasn't in a rush. I let my feet take the lead, my bag light on my back, my body warm in that very specific way you get when food has settled in all the right places. I figured I'd find a room eventually, somewhere clean, somewhere forgettable. Instead, I found them. They were standing on a small bridge over the Tiber, arms wrapped loosely around each other, noses nearly touching, mid-laugh about something I never caught. They looked up as I passed. "Hey!" the man called out, his accent unmistakably Australian. "You're not a local, are you? Is it that obvious?" The woman smiled. "You walk like you're looking for something." "I think I've already found it," I said. "Just looking for a bed now." "Well, lucky you," she grinned. "We know the best one in the city." I walked over, and just like that, we were talking, names, origins, destinations. Their names were Elliot and Marianne. He was a graphic designer. She taught art to children with disabilities. They were on their delayed honeymoon. "Delayed by life," Marianne said with a shrug. "But worth the wait." We wandered slowly, together now. Past the statues of Ponte Sant'Angelo, past shadowed courtyards that whispered stories even the city had half forgotten. "Rome wasn't our first choice," Elliot said. "We were going to go somewhere tropical. But Marianne's always had a thing for ruins and fountains. They go together, don't they?" she added. "Fountains and ruins. Like beauty and time." They asked about me. I hesitated. And then, for the first time, I told the whole story, not in fragments, not laced with grief, but as a whole thing. I told them about Elizabeth. About the compass. About the promise. About the cities, the people, the conversations that became waypoints. I told them I wasn't just traveling anymore, I was carrying. "I'm not trying to let her go," I said. "I'm just trying to let her change." They didn't say anything for a moment. Marianne squeezed my arm. "That's beautiful," she said. "And brave." "Maybe," I said. "But mostly it just feels right." They walked me to a narrow side street just off Campo de Fiori and pointed to a quiet building with potted herbs on the sill and a small, hand-painted sign above the door that simply read Casa di Paola. "Tell Paola we sent you," Elliot said. "She'll take care of you." Inside, it smelled like thyme and old wood. The floor creaked like it had known too many stories to be quiet anymore. A woman, Paola I assumed, looked up from a desk covered in postcards and receipts. She had silver-streaked hair, a linen dress, and eyes that didn't ask questions but knew answers. "Ah," she said, standing. "They told me you'd come." I blinked. "They?" She smiled. "The lovers. They always leave room for someone else." She poured me a glass of red wine, handed me a key with a blue tassel, and led me up a curved staircase that felt like climbing into the spine of a book. At the top, room 4. It was small, clean, warm, and it had a view. From the window, I could see the tiled rooftops of the city center, the curve of the dome of St. Agnes, and the soft ripple of traffic like a lullaby in motion. The curtains billowed slightly. The air carried traces of basil and smoke and something sweet I couldn't name. I didn't unpack. I didn't lie down. I sat at the little desk by the window, pulled out Tomas's cloth-bound notebook, and opened it. Not to stare. To write. And I wrote. Not in mourning. Not in pain. But with purpose. I wrote about Marcus and Threadline. About Camilla's orange cake and her brother's music. About Matteo dancing barefoot on salt, and Chiara's whispered archive of lives. About Volus and the poetry of ruins. About Seamus and the bees. About Clocka and the lighthouse that didn't save, but welcomed. I wrote about Elizabeth. But not her last day. I wrote her laugh. Her joy. Her plans. Her becoming. And I wrote the words I hadn't been able to say until now. Thank you. For dreaming. For loving. For trusting me to carry this. I didn't notice when the ink ran low. I didn't hear the bells ring for midnight. I only knew that when I set the pen down, I felt something shift. Not an ending. Just a beginning that no longer needed permission. I closed the journal. The city below hummed like a promise. And I let myself rest. The cappuccino and the promise. The morning arrived soft and golden, as if the city had exhaled while I slept. I woke in that little room above the tiled rooftops of Rome with a mind that felt unusually clear, like someone had finally wiped down the windows inside my head. The sun filtered in through gauzy curtains, carrying with it the distant hum of scooters, church bells, and espresso machines hissing into the day. I didn't rush. I folded the blanket, ran cold water over my face, slipped the compass around my neck with steady hands. When I stepped into the narrow hallway, the scent of coffee caught me before I reached the stairs. "Buongiorno, viaggiatore," came a voice from below. "Sit. Before the city steals you again." It was Paula, waiting at a small table by the front window, already pouring a cappuccino into a chipped ceramic cup that looked like it had survived at least 3 generations of stories. She had changed into a blue cardigan, and her hair was pulled back loosely, as if even she hadn't quite accepted it was morning yet. "You didn't have to," I said. "I didn't," she replied, sliding the cup toward me. "But I wanted to." I sat. The cappuccino was perfect, hot, strong, topped with foam that folded like memory. "So," she said, cradling her own cup in both hands, "who are you really, and why is there a ghost behind your smile?" I wasn't surprised. Paula had that kind of gaze, direct but kind, the sort that didn't ask for masks. "I've been walking," I said. "For a long time. Through cities. Through grief." Her eyes didn't flinch. I told her about Elizabeth, not everything, just the shape of it. The compass. The promise. The slow transformation of my sadness into something steadier. Something I could speak from. I told her about the stories. The strangers. The places that asked me to stay long enough to listen. Paula listened the way Italians cook, slowly, fully, with every sense. When I finished, she didn't rush to respond. She just sipped her coffee, then set it down gently. "I think," she said, "you're almost ready." "For what?" "To stop walking." I looked at her. She smiled. "There's someone you should meet," she said. "He lives outside the city. Up in the hills. No phone, no internet. Just olives, silence, and books that smell like rain. His name is Alessandro. But most people just call him the old man with the lemon trees. What does he do? He listens. Sometimes tells stories. Sometimes sits with you in the quiet until you hear one of your own. People go to him when their hearts are heavy. They always come back lighter. Why?" She raised an eyebrow. "Because he's not trying to fix anything. Just remind you of what doesn't need fixing." I let the idea settle, then nodded. "Where is he?" She scribbled something on a napkin. "Not an address, directions. Turn here. Look for the tree with the crooked branch. Walk until you stop hearing cars. You'll find him," she said. "He'll be outside. He's always outside." I folded the napkin and tucked it into my pocket. Before I left, she touched my arm and said, "Quando il cuore pronto, anche il silenzio diventa risposta." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" "When the heart is ready," she translated. "Even silence becomes an answer." We hugged, brief, warm, knowing. Then I stepped into the Roman morning and followed the quiet. The old man and the language of olive trees. The road stretched longer than I expected. Paula's napkin had been precise, but I still managed to lose about 3 hours somewhere between a wrong turn, a broken roadside map, and an enthusiastic farmer who insisted I stop for a glass of fig wine that tasted like summer regrets. By the time I arrived, it was just after noon, and the sun was brutal, burning everything it touched into silence. My shirt clung to me like a second skin, and dust coated my boots and thoughts alike. The world felt paused. And there he was. Just as Paula had described. Alessandro, an old man seated beneath a massive olive tree that looked older than half of Rome. He sat on a low wooden chair, the kind that looked like it had never been bought, only inherited. His straw hat was tilted just enough to shade his face, and his eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see, somewhere out beyond the hills, where the sky folded into heat. He didn't move when I approached. Just raised one hand in a lazy half-wave. "Say in retardo," he said without looking at me. "You're late." "I got lost," I said. He turned then. And when he looked at me, really looked, I felt suddenly, impossibly seen. Not judged. Not scanned. Just seen. He studied my face for maybe 3 seconds, then nodded. "Hai gli occhi pieni. Your eyes are full," he said. "Sit. You need to listen." He patted the stone bench beside him. I sat. And he began. He spoke slowly, his voice like the wind sliding over gravel, aged, dry, but oddly melodic. At first, it was mostly Italian, scattered with occasional English words like breadcrumbs for me to follow. But something strange happened as he went on. I understood him. Not every word, but the story. The meaning behind it. It wasn't because my Italian had suddenly improved. It was because he wasn't speaking to my ears. He was speaking to something older in me. He told the story of a man who built a house on the edge of a cliff. Everyone told him not to, too dangerous, too lonely, too exposed. But he built it anyway. Not for comfort, but for perspective. He wanted to be closer to the sky. One day, a storm came. The worst the coast had seen in decades. The waves clawed at the rocks. The house trembled. The man thought he would die. He held onto the walls, whispered to the wind, promised to change everything if he lived. But the house held. Not because it was strong, but because it was anchored. Its foundation was made from the stone beneath it. Carved directly into the cliff. It didn't resist the wind. It leaned into it. And when the storm passed, the man didn't leave. He planted a garden. "You see?" Alessandro said, switching briefly to English, tapping the side of his temple with a single finger. "Grief is not the storm. It is the cliff. You build on it, or you fall." I swallowed hard. He wasn't done. He told me about his own loss. His wife, 30 years gone. A painter. A woman who used to sing to the trees when she thought no one was listening. When she died, he said, I stopped speaking. For 1 year. Not a word. I thought if I said her name, I would break. He stared out at the hills. But one day, a boy got lost near here. A little boy, maybe 6. Came crying to my door. No parents. Just a name on his coat tag. Luca. And I had to speak. To comfort him. He turned back to me. "Così," he said. I spoke. And I didn't break. There was silence between us. But not an awkward one. A fertile one. He poured me water from a ceramic jug and offered me olives and bread and a soft wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth. I ate with the reverence of someone who knows they're being fed more than food. As the light tilted golden and the breeze returned to soften the heat, I realized hours had passed. The sun had dropped lower, the olive branches casting long, lace shadows over the dust. "You'll sleep here tonight," Alessandro said. Not a suggestion. Just the truth. "I didn't bring anything," I replied. "You brought yourself. Basta così. That's enough." He led me to a small guest room through the back of a crumbling stone house. It smelled like thyme, lemon soap, and the faintest trace of turpentine, probably the ghosts of old paintings. Before he left me, he said, "Domani non parliamo." Tomorrow we won't speak. Why? Because silence too has stories. But only after the ears are empty. He smiled. Then shut the door. And I sat on the bed. The window was open. The stars were starting to hum. And for the first time in I don't know how long, I felt light. not like something had been removed, but like something had been made clear. I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. I'm not surviving anymore. I'm simply alive. Then I slept, and the olive trees swayed all night above me, like a lullaby. The language of stillness. Morning came like a secret. I woke to birdsong and the soft creak of old wood expanding in the light. The room was warm and hushed, as though the air had learned to be careful. I dressed slowly, folded the blanket at the end of the bed, and stepped outside barefoot. The olive tree was already casting its dappled shade across the yard. Alessandro was there, exactly as I'd left him. Same chair, same tilt of the hat, same gaze stretched out toward a world I couldn't quite see. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I just walked over and sat beside him on the same stone bench, the one that still held the imprint of yesterday's conversation. And we sat. For minutes. Then hours. No sound passed between us, not in speech. But something was speaking. Something older than language. His presence didn't fill the silence. It invited it. And for the first time in my life, I felt no pressure to say anything profound. No need to explain who I was or what I had lost. No urge to perform my pain. Just being. It felt like the deepest conversation I'd ever had. Eventually, the sun shifted overhead, and Alessandro stirred. He stood slowly, his knees cracking in protest. Then, without a word, he walked down the slope toward the stone house and disappeared inside. I didn't follow. I stayed under the olive tree, watching the wind ripple the branches like someone gently rearranging the air. He returned a few minutes later with a small cloth bundle in his hand. He placed it in my palm. No explanation. Just a look that said, "This is for you, and you already know why." I unfolded the bundle. Inside was a small carved olive wood pendant, shaped like a spiral, or maybe a wave. There was a single word etched into the back in tiny, almost imperceptible lettering. Ancora. Not again. But still. Still here. Still going. Still loving. Still. Alessandro looked at me, his eyes bright beneath the shadow of his hat. Aora. It's time. I nodded. I didn't cry. I didn't say goodbye. I just slipped the pendant into my pocket, next to the compass, and began walking. The road felt different this time. Not lighter. Just clearer. Like I'd stopped asking it to carry me and started walking alongside it instead. By the time I reached the station, the city had returned in fragments. Cars, voices, pigeons fighting over crumbs. Rome was already warming up for another day of being itself. At the platform, I bought a ticket without looking too hard at the destination. It didn't matter anymore. Everywhere I went, she would come too. Not behind me. Not beside me. Through me. I could finally see the world again, not despite Elizabeth's absence, but because her story was now part of how I looked at everything. The way sunlight leaned through old glass. The way a stranger's laughter carried down an alley. The way silence could speak if you sat still long enough. I boarded the train with no fear in my chest. Only breath. And the feeling that the journey was just beginning again. Not to escape. Not even to heal. But to share. To show her the world. Through my eyes. And to let the world keep showing me what's next.